Hi, this is Dr. Nick. I'm the Incrementalist here with incremental insights for better business, better health.
And I'm Fred Goldstein, the president of Accountable Health, and I'm here helping companies reopen and operate during the COVID pandemic.
So, Fred, thinking about that specifically and reopening, we're now many months into this experience and there are lots of things going on. And one of the things that we're certainly hearing about is the issue of following directions, specifically around testing. So if you have an employee that tests positive, they go into isolation, and there are very specific terms in terms of the duration that takes place based on symptoms, no symptoms, and so forth. But whilst you're in that dedicated time of isolation, you're supposed to stay isolated, hence the term. What do you do as a business when somebody breaks that isolation and comes to your business?
Well, this is really a fascinating area, Nick, and it sort of goes with the whole issue of behavior and following the rules, whether it's wearing a mask, etc. Obviously, when you're in isolation, that's really the highest level you can get to. You, in essence, have the illness. You're supposed to spend your 14 days isolated from people, even within your household or wherever you are. But as an employer, if they manage to show up for work or did show up for work, you have the right to obviously tell them they can't come in and head back. And we have heard instances of variations of people breaking isolation. And then you need to step that down a little bit, I guess, Nick, and think about what about quarantine and how is that allowed or not allowed? And I know you had some thoughts on that and have actually seen some of the rules and regs around quarantine and what you're allowed to do or not do.
Yeah, so it's important to sort of separate those two. I've certainly heard folks using them interchangeably. They're not interchangeable or not for the purposes of the way that the terms are used. Quarantine is the process by which you take somebody who is under suspicion. So in this case, you've been a close contact of somebody who's shown up positive. Isolation is you have tested positive or have symptoms and are therefore deemed infected, albeit you could be excluded at some point if you have symptoms, but it turns out you've got a cold, for instance, or you had a temperature, but the temperature resolves potentially, but more complicated. As usual, every time I talk about this, what I realize is, this stuff is not simple. You need help, you need guidance through it because it's complicated. But let's go back to quarantine. So you've had contact with somebody and you've been in their presence for the time that we deem to be significant from a risk perspective. And importantly, typically inside. So inside is a higher risk. If that's the case, you then have to go into quarantine and you're under suspicion. And we're not testing everybody that goes into quarantine. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think you treat that on a case-by-case basis. But what do you do in quarantine? Well, you try and keep yourself away, but it's not the same instance where we say you should completely isolate. We give you some flexibility typically, and you'll wear masks. If you're living in a communal home, then you should be wearing some kind of face covering if those other individuals aren't contacts, and you should keep yourself away. But suppose you need to go out and get. So in certain instances, you see countries doing this where you can come in, you're quarantining, but what do? You sit in a room and you're completely isolated and you get no food and water for 14 days, or are they bringing services in? So it raises a number of issues. And I think what it is you should be on high alert and prevent or do everything in your power. And what is that? Physical distancing, face coverings, and good cleanliness, and specifically hand washing and so forth, to limit your potential of spreading the disease. But you shouldn't be coming into work, right? Because that's now an additional risk.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating as you begin to take a look at this from the other side. So what do we as a society or we as individuals do when we come across people who, for example, are supposed to be quarantined or isolated and are out and about, perhaps appropriately under certain regs in the case of a quarantine, and furthermore, with masks. And we're seeing that issue all over the place with places requiring masks. There's signs on the door, and you go inside, and there are individuals who have chosen to come in without them. And how do you then go ahead and talk to them, or do you just leave it alone? And it creates a really difficult situation and a stressful situation for those people involved in it. And I don't think we yet have a good answer. We're seeing various approaches to incent positive behavior. We are seeing certain approaches that are used to de-incent negative behavior. We saw the recent case with SMU where the students were not socially isolating at a football game and not wearing masks, and they chose to throw them out of the game, the entire student body in that section. So it creates a difficult situation that needs to be looked at, but you would hope that people would ultimately recognize that the right thing to do is to do these behaviors so that we can then move forward and reopen safer.
And, the point I would pick up here is, this is a country that's built on freedoms and, individual rights. And, I'm an immigrant. I respect that. That's one of the reasons that this is an attractive place. And, I don't want to break that. But ultimately, somebody asked me recently, relative to one of my posts and my sort of principle of you've got to persist with this is, what's my ultimate goal? Well, my ultimate goal is I want the country to reopen and return to something close to whatever the normal is going to be. And it's going to be different. Let's be clear. It's not going to be the same, but I want it to be as similar as possible. And that is achievable. But if you go through this cycle and you have a variation in response and you fail to sort of enact that across the whole population, what happens is you end up with these pockets that then respread the disease. South Korea essentially enacted a policy that, instilled this requirement. And I'll go back to this principle of wearing a face covering. Before COVID-19 broke out, I happened to be in Japan and noticed all these people wearing masks. Why were they wearing masks? They were doing it to protect their fellow citizens because they were feeling, they essentially, I'm imagining, had symptoms and didn't want to spread whatever it was they had. Noticeably, the Southern Hemisphere has had a lower incidence of flu because everybody's been wearing face coverings. So we've actually managed to reduce another disease, which is a great thing. So this is not about taking freedoms away. It's about delivering a normality back by following some guidelines that are founded in science today for an extended period of time, and then allowing us to return to some level of normality.
Absolutely. And your example is perfectly highlighted by what's happening in New York right now, where they're considering shutting down certain zip codes over in Brooklyn because they have suddenly had outbreaks there because people are no longer following the regs. Now, they're not shutting down everything, but they're selectively looking at about 9 or so zip codes because their rates of infection have gone up because people are no longer social isolating and distancing. They're not wearing their masks as often, and they're seeing this spike. So everyone else can stay open. We can reopen more and more if we follow the regs. So great point you made there, Nick. Another fantastic week. Thanks again. This is Fred Goldstein with Accountable Health.
Hi, and this is Dr. Nick. I'm the incrementalist here with incremental insights for a better business, better health.